Professor Fredo Rivera, Sidharth Bhatia, Mr. Mukherjee, fellow trustees and friends. I'm Atul Kumar, trustee of Art Deco Mumbai Trust. I'm going to take 5 minutes of your time to just give you a quick introduction to some of the work that we've been doing, after which Professor Rivera will present his lecture. The 4 pillars around which our work centers are listed above. We focus on research, documentation, outreach, and advocacy. Our outreach endeavor has been significant and included a commission by Mumbai Mirror to write an 11-article series on Mumbai's Deco neighborhoods, which literally took Deco into every single Mumbai home. A copy of that compilation is available outside, and if you haven't got a copy, then please do get one. Your donation will help us sustain the activities of our trust. Our website is now the single largest public domain repository of information on Art Deco in Mumbai. Academics, researchers, historians, architects, and city buffs will enjoy it. What you're seeing on the screen right now is basically the inventory section of an online map. You can access this on any handheld device as you walk around the city and enjoy the city's deco. A significant part of our work involves photo documentation, and this has now covered Kolaba, Matunga, Dadar Parsi Colony, and many more neighborhoods across Mumbai. Just these 3 neighborhoods involved fieldwork which covered 870 buildings. These 3 neighborhoods, as you can see, the block map of Matunga East, which is what you're looking at, had a total of 19 blocks, which comprised of 274 buildings, of which 89 are Art Deco, and those are highlighted in the darker color in black. It actually has is one of the densest neighborhoods in Bombay. As on date, our inventory has now identified 340 buildings across Mumbai, and this documentation continues as a major ongoing effort. As you can imagine, Bombay's density makes this time-consuming and a rigorous effort, taking a lot of dedication from my team. And many of the interns who worked with us are here today, and I'm so glad to see you. Our outreach and advocacy includes workshops, lectures, walking tours. One of the recent highlights is our collaboration with the Pomegranate Workshop, led by Priya Srinivasan. Thank you for coming here today, Priya. Over 5 days, we took 50 school children a day for a deco walk at the Oval, post which they designed and created their own Art Deco buildings. Mind you, these were students from grade 3 to grade 7. Their boundless curiosity, knowledge, and the way they responded to and embraced Deco made it a very special experience for us. It was refreshing to see their expression of Deco designs. Sohani from grade 4 has drawn what looks like a face as a building facade, but the eyes are inspired by porthole windows. The nose resembles the glass panel that you see at Shiv Shanti or Rajab Mahal, and one can clearly see symmetry in her design. Gareth from grade 6 fuses 21st and 20th century with his take on Wakanda for life, using waveform balconies from Court View. Thank you, Priya. We want many more of these initiatives with the Pomegranate Workshop. Lastly, I'd like to make a special mention of our membership of the ICADS. It's part of our international advocacy initiative. It was a long and elaborate process getting membership. Our membership to this organization was supported unanimously by 13 countries. And I'm pleased to inform you that we are now a member. And most importantly, our city's beautiful deco is now firmly on the world map. We have... Thank you. We have been invited to the World Art Deco Congress in Argentina in November 2019, and we will share more details with those of you who would like to come. Now for the main event of the evening, the lecture by Professor Rivera and his conversation with Sidharth. Sidharth, may I request you to please come and introduce us to Professor Rivera?
So what a pleasant surprise on a Friday evening to see so many people here. I bet most of them have come for this and the lecture, much as what you would try to say, Atul. I met Professor Rivera the other day, and we all knew about Miami, and we do know about a few other cities in the world. The more you read, the more you're astounded how this globalized movement, as it were, happened in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And Bombay at that time was a cosmopolitan, aspirational city, joined in. But you see that there are Art Deco iterations in, Eritrea, in Napier in New Zealand, Cuba. I think you're going to talk a bit about Cuba, and Egypt, and many other places. But obviously there are, Miami of course, but obviously there are, differences, there are similarities. What you see in New York or Chicago is very different from what you would see in a tropical climate. So when Atul told me about this talk and I said that somebody is going to actually bring these connections together, I thought it was a great opportunity, and clearly that has resonated. So I'm going to give an introduction. Professor Fredo Rivera is assistant professor in art history at Grinnell College in Iowa. He teaches classes on modern and contemporary architecture and urbanism and Caribbean art and visual culture. He's written on Cuban art and architecture, Haitian photography and visual culture, and on art and urbanization in Miami. Formerly a visiting assistant professor of architectural history and theory at Florida Atlantic University and the Andrew W. Mellon pre-doctoral fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies of the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Rivera has also worked as an Art Deco tour guide in Miami Beach, a topic he is most passionate about. I was delighted to see, Atul, that you're taking school children with Pomegranate, of which I know a little bit because they've been at it for many, many years. And it's best to catch them young to make them understand that 20th century architecture in this city was something that now, when we are discovering it, it was modern then and it continues to be modern now. And it's a shame that we are seeing some of them go, but I'm wonderful that you're catching them young. So without further ado, Professor Rivera.
Thank you. Full house. I'd like to give a great thank you to Art Deco Mumbai. Atul, Nietzsche, the whole staff have been wonderful and very welcoming here in Mumbai. I'd also like to give a thank you to Grinnell College, particularly the Institute for Global Engagement, which helped fund my visit to this trip, as well as my research assistant, Moses Herrera, who's been helping me gather images for this lecture today. Today, I'm going to be lecturing primarily on Miami, but what I'm really interested in is trying to see what are those connections between Miami and Mumbai, and I'll talk a little bit about Havana, so we could think about the context of Art Deco today. And Miami is a particularly rich place to think about Art Deco because currently, arguably, we have the largest amount of Art Deco buildings in the world within the sort of historic Art Deco district, but it's also a great model for thinking about architectural preservation. And I'll talk more about that history at the Miami Design Preservation League. Now, my interest in Mumbai happened during my very first trip to India in 2005. I was visiting one of my very best friends from college, who's from Mumbai, and I just immediately fell in love with the city. I was in college in the Midwest in the US, but I was from Miami, and I felt as if I had gone back home. And it was particularly the architecture, not just the Art Deco architecture, but the modern architecture, the skyscrapers everywhere, sort of the feeling of an aspirational city. Now, in his book, Bombay Art Deco, Architecture, A Visual Journey, Naveen Ramani makes these direct connections to Miami and Mumbai. And I'm going to quote him directly because I think it summarizes nicely what connects these two cities. He writes, and I quote, As subtropical cities built partly on land reclaimed from bay waters during the early 20th century, Bombay and Miami Beach share a geological and sociological, as well as a stylistic history. Generations of middle-class families created a residential culture in neighborhoods animated by large concentrations of Art Deco architecture. In both cities, the architectural design addressed their seaside geography and warm climate, optimism about the modern age, and a Hollywood-inspired sense of romance. In Miami Beach, a 1920s Mediterranean style preceded the Art Deco movement just as the Victorian Gothic tradition of the mid-19th century predated Bombay's. When each city developed its Art Deco adaptation, it included elements that, unknown to the architects of the time on either continent, would mirror the other with district correlations. Twin-like pairings of buildings appear in these two cities, half a world apart. And I made some associations with sort of my own interest in Miami's visual culture. And I bring these two examples in the beginning because, to me, there is this very interesting relationship between postmodern architecture and sort of the newly arisen interest in Art Deco. This is the example of the Atlantis condominium. It's done by Architectonica. It was a project led by the architect Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, and she was a major figure in sort of interest in preserving Art Deco architecture. And a little later, I'll talk more about Barbara Baer Capitman. She is sort of seen as sort of our savior of Art Deco within the context of Miami, and she was the founding member of the Miami Design Preservation League, which documented Art Deco, advocated for it in a time when it was under threat by developers who wanted to tear down a lot of dilapidated buildings. And she was personal friends both with Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, quite prominently Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, who are two of the most prominent architects of postmodern architecture in the United States. They wrote a book called Learning from Las Vegas, which is very much a model for thinking visually. But postmodernism sort of adapts the type of playfulness that we see in Art Deco. So to me, it's interesting that in this era where we've gone beyond sort of high modernism in architecture and we've gone towards postmodernism architecture, there's this renewed interest in Art Deco, which is formerly sort of dismissed or not taken seriously at an academic level. Now, I'm going to begin generally talking about Art Deco. The term Art Deco does not come into prominence until the 1960s. The first time it's really mentioned in English language literature is by the architectural historian Bevis Hillier, who works on an exhibition and on a publication in 1968. And it's a term that that sort of draws its name from this famous exposition in 1925 in Paris, the Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes. Again, that's from Art Deco. And this was a major design, art, and architecture exposition. And it wasn't just about Art Deco. It was kind of showing what the trends were at the time broadly. It had many participants. And in the context of France, this type of style, whether we're talking about graphic design, fashion, jewelry design, architecture, it was simply referred to as moderne. And here you can have some examples of the temporary pavilions that were created during the Exposition des Arts Décoratifs. And you can see the variety within the pavilion. So here we have sort of an example of constructivist architecture by Konstantin Melnikov, the Soviet pavilion. And quite prominently, you have Le Corbusier's Pavilion de l'Esprit Nouveau, or the Pavilion of the New Spirit. Now, Le Corbusier is a very interesting figure. A lot of the ideas he espouses, you could argue, are influential in Art Deco. In his book, Towards a New Architecture, which is just published a couple years after this, he describes the house as the machine for living in. But he views the house as also a space of leisure. So he's trying to create this sort of modern functionalist architecture that also has very fascinating design. And Art Deco kind of gains influence from what's broadly happening in modern architecture in Europe in the 1920s, which is sort of this move towards a functionalist architecture that celebrates the machine age. And then at the same time, it's also drawing inspiration from Art Nouveau, sort of a style prior to it. And what it does is it takes these sort of more floral designs of Art Nouveau and it uses geometric abstraction and various influences within it. Now, I just want to quote Le Corbusier real quick, because Le Corbusier did not like Miami, and I think it's really fascinating. In 1950, he was en route to Bogota, and he passed through New York and Miami, and he said of them, and he wrote in his sketchbook, New York/Miami, neither of them very reassuring. And he goes on in the book to write about Miami architects, writing, all great guys, ardent, ideal, professional qualities, very much artists, consider me to be the leader of modern architecture. Build very honestly, but eccentricities for rich people. Social relevance is not at stake here. So he's kind of making this critique, and one of the reasons Art Deco wasn't studied in a sort of serious academic manner until really the 1990s, when you have architectural historians like Tim Benton and Alistair Duncan writing publications about Art Deco, was because it wasn't attached to a body of literature. And it was sort of seen as a commercial form of architecture. I think when you look more closely at it, it's a lot more complicated. And I think two of the important things, I mentioned the spirit of the machine age. Art Deco very much celebrates this idea of the future. So oftentimes it'll emulate sort of different types of technologies, radios, ships, cars. But it also looks towards the past, and it looks towards the past in a very sort of diverse global way. And some of the things that would have been of interest within the 1925 exposition, there was sort of this sort of Orientalism. So there's interest in Japanese art and design, Chinese art and design. You also had what was an Egyptophilia of the era. You have just 3 years prior the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, and you have the sudden raised interest, and all of these objects are coming to Paris and people are seeing them and the designers are being inspired from it. So it's drawing from the past selectively, and it's drawing from images of what's seen as sort of the future of technology, and it's celebrating both in this sort of aspirational sense. Now, probably the most classic example of Art Deco of all the pavilions was Pierre Petit's Hotel d'un Collectionneur, which was thought to be sort of the ideal of French Art Deco, where you could begin to see some of these sort of design aspects. I'm even just looking at the chandelier there. It's kind of tiered, almost like a ziggurat. So you get a lot of ziggurat inspirations, which goes both to Mesopotamia, but also an interest in Mesoamerican, particularly Mayan architecture. Now, Art Deco in the United States, probably the most famous examples, and I'll show the two most famous examples in the US. One is the Chrysler Building. When this building was completed, it was for 11 months the tallest building in the world. It was surpassed by another Art Deco building, the Empire State Building. And this very much emulates the ideals of Art Deco. You have sort of forming over these arches, these sort of sun rays along sort of the steel spire. So it's using new material in a unique way to really represent sort of this notion of aspiration. And I think you get that really clear with these sort of eagle wings. It's sort of this abstracted image of an eagle. You don't have the body, you just have the wings. It's almost like a gargoyle, but it's as if it's soaring from the building. It's showing that sense of movement. One of the things that is frequent within Art Deco, actually I'll use this. You'll see these bands here. Art Deco very inventively uses line as a way to sort of create visual interest and dynamism. I think this is significant, particularly in Miami Beach, where a lot of the buildings are small, so sometimes the use of horizontal and vertical lines helps make the building seem grander than it is. In the context of the Chrysler Building, clearly it's a massive building. And then you'll also see certain references. We're going to see this in examples of Miami architecture. You have sort of these circular shapes. In the context of Miami, these will often refer to train wheels. So you have this sort of notion of sort of movement through space reflected in the architecture. Here you could see one with just the eagle head and not the wings. Now, another very famous building, and I'm just going to go through this one. I have too many slides, forgive me, and I'm trying to do this within 45 minutes. Well, another very famous building is John and Donald Parkinson's Bullocks, Wilshire. This was opened as a department store in Los Angeles. It's currently closed. I'd walked by it in January and wasn't able to enter in, but it's part of a law school today. And this is thought to be sort of the classic Hollywood Art Deco, and if you look at certain Hollywood films, you might see the interior lobby. In many ways, it's a much squatter building than the Chrysler Building, but you could see similarities in the visual aesthetic, particularly with the use of sort of vertical lines throughout. In this case, cast iron embellishments that have oxidized over time. But what's really spectacular about this building is some of its interior elements and decor. And particularly here, you could see a mural that's very much showing this relationship of an inspiration of abstract painting in combination with forms of transportation. So really giving you that sort of sense of movement. And that sort of follows into the vestibule, which is designed by the interior designer Jock Peters. So here you would have had displays back then for jewelry. And you would go through this really fabulous vestibule with this quite spectacular marble flooring, as well as these sort of lighting fixtures that, again, used vertical and horizontal lines to sort of create this sort of sense of grandeur. And here you have the elevator doors, which I just think are spectacular. Now, another thing is you'll see the sort of, it's almost sort of this beveled, it's sort of this protrusion in, it's sort of the inverted ziggurat, sort of the way the door comes out, and you go in, and you can imagine the elevator doors opening and closing. It's a space full of visual interest. Now, Art Deco in the United States really comes to being in the 1920s, and it's kind of reflecting what is popular globally, one could argue, and it just speaks to sort of what's popular in the time. But we begin to see Art Deco everywhere, and you could kind of connect it with this sort of roaring 20s, this idea of wealth. The buildings are using both new materials, but also really refined materials, such as marble. And we see this in the context of Cuba. I'm going to talk about Cuba briefly, partially because it's within 120 miles of Miami, but also because Art Deco is very different in Cuba than Miami and Mumbai. And I think one of the reasons is Art Deco comes a little bit earlier, one could argue, to the context of Cuba. There's a couple reasons for that. One is Cuban architects were traveling to Europe in this era. They were coming back, and they were forming their own publications. And we'll see this difference in Miami architects. The Miami architects didn't do what would be considered the Grand Tour, which was thought to be sort of an homage of popular architects of the time, that you go to Europe, you get inspiration, you come back to the States. A lot of these architects had only practiced in the US while they were adapting these ideas. And so the Cuban architects, Eduardo Luis Rodriguez, the Cuban architectural historian, he writes, quote, "The European architectural avant-garde was introduced through many vehicles, professional journals being one of them. After 1925, the Revista del Colegio de Arquitectos de La Habana and El Arquitecto, those are two journals, introduced several modern currents that had taken place shortly before in Europe, broadcasted the new concepts and their corresponding polemics, and entered into a healthy debate. El Arquitecto published the first article about the new style in 1926. In it, one finds a clear reference to the ideal posed by Le Corbusier and towards a new architecture. Quote, other quite beautiful forms of which we think about daily constitute the true architecture of the time and have the present moment. A modernity that spurs our spirits. They are those that we can call dynamic architecture, the great transatlantic ships with the gracious and energetic curves, the formidable battleships, the gigantic locomotives, the airplanes." So in one sense, you have Cuban periodicals, architectural periodicals among sort of this professional class, talking about the trends of the time and implementing it. And I think this is probably the most famous example of Art Deco in Cuba. This is the Edificio Bacardi. It was the Bacardi headquarters, designed in 1928 and finished in 1930. And it is, in a way, it's Art Deco that is responding to the local context, to the local architecture. So sometimes you'll see Moorish elements within it. You have a lot of Cuban emigres from southern Spain who bring those sort of architectural influences. But then again, you see this ziggurat design leading up to this sort of famous, you see a bat on a globe, so that's the logo of the Bacardi brand within the building. So it's bringing in both local and significant regional influences with more global influences. And the lobby is quite spectacular. You could see with sort of this beveled ceiling, the use of sort of these rich marble floors, and also these really fantastic light fixtures. So this, to me, even though it's stylistically different from the New York, is more akin to the type of Art Deco you see in New York versus that of Miami, though Havana does have examples like Miami. Probably another significant sort of early entry of Art Deco is the sort of, this is actually a really fantastic story behind this house. So it's the Casa Catalina Laza and Juan de Pedro Barro. Cuba, among the Cuban elite, there were very sort of conservative Moors. Actually, divorce was not allowed in Cuban law during this sort of what was considered the Republican era of Cuba. And Catalina Laza was married, and Juan de Pedro Barro was a sugar baron who was a widower as well, and they kind of fell in love and had an affair, and they decided to go to France to get married. And so this was a huge scandal among the Cuban elite at the moment. Catalina Laza was a relative of one of the former presidents of Cuba. Her family had huge influence in Santa Clara. And so they run off to France, and they're able, through a loophole in the law, get married there, get their divorce there, get married, and come back. And they come back with the famous French designer René Lalique. Now, Lalique is most known for his glassware, and I apologize because this image, you cannot see the fantastic embossed sort of glass here, but you can see the sort of interior sort of garden patio area that's in the backyard of the house, which is quite fantastic. So they actually end up bringing René Lalique from Paris to Havana in 1926, and he works on the interior design of this home. So this is a very classic example of one of the most prominent figures of Art Deco in Paris coming to Cuba and then inspiring other artists. And you begin to see other people working in glasswork in Cuba adopting these designs. Now, probably another one of the most famous Art Deco buildings is by the firm Mira and Rosich. This is the Edificio López Serrano. And this is thought to be sort of a miniature New York skyscraper. It's trying to emulate the feeling of a New York skyscraper, but at 18 stories. It's today a headache because the elevator doesn't work, so if you live in a high floor, it's not pleasant. But you really get the sense of sort of the richness of Art Deco, the influence of the ziggurat design with these archways, the really fantastic marble work here. And this is actually, the star is supposed to represent the Republic in the context of Cuba. So you could see these various interior elements, this really fantastic railing that's sort of leading up, the sculptural elements along the staircase. Just a really wonderful building that's full of a lot of design as you engage it, but also tries to emulate that idea of the skyscraper within a smaller scale. It's a building that really stands out within its setting. Now, I used to live in a building just 2 buildings down on the same street that's also by Mira and Rosich. Some people call it the Serranito, the mini one. It doesn't have an official name. But it's a similar apartment building that's 5 stories and uses a lot of the same visual elements. And I'm just going to show one. There's many examples of Art Deco I could show, and all of these examples are from the context of Havana, but if you travel throughout Cuba, you can find examples of Art Deco in almost any city in Cuba, including smaller towns. So anything that was built, particularly in the 1930s, would often adopt this sort of Art Deco aesthetic, especially when you have the expansion of theaters and cinemas throughout Cuba. And here's an example of one that was just a couple blocks from another place where I used to live, the Fausta Cinema. And I just love showing this image because this is a sort of rethought by an artist. This is a Colombian artist who visited Havana for the Biennale in 2012, and he covered the building in sculptures of ants. So it's almost as if they're taking over the building. But I'm going to focus more on Miami today, and this talk is going to have 2 parts. One, I'm going to talk about the history of Art Deco, focusing on particularly on a couple of architects. And then I'm going to focus more on sort of contemporary considerations with Art Deco. Now, Miami Beach, like Mumbai, is very much made of reconstituted lands. And really the person who's thought to be sort of the father of Miami Beach, or the original person who inhabited Miami Beach, is John Collins. Now, Miami was a fairly young city at this time. It was incorporated in 1896. It's the only major city in the U.S. Founded by a woman, Julia Tuttle. And she ends up inheriting land from her father along the Miami River, moves there and ends up convincing Henry Flagler, who's the big rail tycoon, to come down to Miami. If Florida has a huge freeze, doesn't reach Miami, she sends him orange blossoms. And he comes down, brings the train to Miami, and it becomes sort of this getaway for the wealthy. Almost immediately. So in the 1900s, the 19-teens, you have a lot of wealthy people building second homes and just coming to Miami for 2 or 3 months out of the year. New forms of telecommunication allow a lot of people who have businesses in the Midwest and the Northeast to still run their businesses from Miami. And across the bay, Biscayne Bay, is what's today considered Miami Beach. It was very much a swampy mangrove, wasn't inhabitable. The original Native American population, which had largely fled Miami-Dade during the Seminole Wars in the mid-19th century, we know they lived on the Miami side of the bay, but we also know that they never lived on the Miami Beach side, partially because it was full of very dense mangroves. But John Collins was a Quaker from New Jersey, and he had this desire to sort of create coconut plantations and also grow a fruit that was called alligator pear, otherwise known as avocado today. And so he starts attempting to grow this. He has a lot of issues. First, you have to clear the mangroves, which is quite arduous labor. And second, it's hard to get the produce across. So in 1912, he starts building this bridge. And he runs out of funds by 1913 and is unable to finish it. But to his left, there is a man by the name of Carl G. Fisher. Carl Fisher became famous for creating the patent for something called Prestolite, and it was the main headlights used for cars in the 19-teens. And he actually sold it, Prestolite, I believe it was around $9 million, which would be about close to $250 million today. So he, after sort of developing this patent and becoming part of being a significant figure with the automobile industry, becomes interested in being a developer. Now, he's famous for funding 2 highways. He builds the Lincoln Highway, which connects New York to San Francisco. He also builds the Dixie Highway, which goes down from New York in the Midwest to Miami. And he sort of meets John Collins, sees him struggling, and makes a deal. John Collins owns most of the land in South Beach. He ends up trading a lot of the land and ends up funding the finishing of this wooden bridge. In its time, it's considered the longest wooden bridge in the world. I don't know if this is true. I've not been able to verify it, but it's a popular claim, especially in the media of that time. And this creates a direct connection. And Miami Beach, through the development of Carl G. Fisher, very much becomes this new playground for the rich. You need a car to get there. You can't get there merely by train. Now, I do want to emphasize the amount of arduous labor this took, and this was primarily black workers from the US South and the Bahamas who had sort of moved to Miami for new economic opportunities, and then had the sort of the labor of basically undoing the mangroves and making the land pavable for development. Miami was also a city of the US segregated South in this era. So Miami Beach, up until the 1950s, if you were African American, you were allowed to come to the beach to work, but you had to return. You were not allowed to stay in the beach. In the late 1920s, they started allowing Jews to live on the beach, but a lot of buildings had separate entrances for Jews. So this was a segregated city, and I think that's important to think about when we think about the context of Art Deco in Miami, that it's happening in this sort of getaway that's part of the segregated South in the United States. But here you could see a great example of how much the landscape is transformed. You have this sort of very swampy mangrove forest that's then taken over by flat land and sort of this very strict grid plan that very much defines Miami Beach today. What I really love about this image is you can see this is the beginning of, here you can see this is Belle Isle, and this is the beginning of what's today the Venetian Causeway. So the former Collins Bridge is eventually replaced by 2 causeways or bridges. One's what's today the MacArthur Causeway that connects from 5th Street, and then this one connects near Lincoln Road, which is the main thoroughfare in Miami Beach, and it connects to the mainland. And what they started doing was the Army Corps of Engineers started dredging Biscayne Bay significantly. It was a much shallower, murkier bay, and creating these artificial islands. So if you're in an inhabited island between Miami and Miami Beach, it is an artificial island that was created in the 1920s era. And here you have a great photograph of a drawing that sort of shows the original plan, what is today the Venetian Causeway and what's become the MacArthur Causeway, famous Star Island where a lot of celebrities live. And then here you can also see an aerial view of Miami Beach. Now, one important thing that happens that prior to sort of the advent of Art Deco in Miami Beach is the Great Hurricane of 1926. A lot of people theorize that it was a Category 5 hurricane. Buildings in Miami Beach were primarily built out of 2 materials. One was oolitic limestone or coral rock. I'll show some Art Deco examples that incorporate this material. Others were built out of wood. Because this was a place where a lot of people just came for 2 or 3 months out of the year. And the hurricane absolutely obliterated Miami Beach, and it had to very much be built from the ground up. And this photo doesn't show it well, but there's a lot of historic photographs that are much more close up that show the extreme level of destruction. It's probably the greatest destruction Miami Beach has experienced from a hurricane yet. Now, Art Deco really doesn't come into the beach until around the early 1930s, and there's 2 big factors. One is you have the Prohibition up until 1933. Miami becomes known during the Prohibition as this free-wheeling city. You have all these rum runners who are bringing rum from the Bahamas and Cuba into Miami and then sort of going up. So you suddenly have the presence of the mafia within Miami. And then the other factor is sort of the growth of tourism, which really happens beginning around 33, 34, which you have as a direct rail connection to Miami Beach along what's today the MacArthur Causeway, back then the Miami-Dade County Causeway, that allows more middle-class populations to come to Miami. So a lot of the hotels you see today in South Beach, with a couple of exceptions that I will show, were largely meant for a new burgeoning middle class out of the Great Depression who wanted to experience sort of the glamour of being in sort of this new, more futuristic city. But I showed this example because this is one of the earliest examples of Art Deco I could find. It's also really interesting. Russell T. Pancoast is the grandson of John Collins. His son and his grandson became architects, interestingly enough. And this was originally the John S. Collins Memorial Library. Today it's the Bass Museum. They just reopened. They have a really fantastic art collection. But this is a great example of an Art Deco building that is also made entirely out of coral rock or oolitic limestone. And I'll show some up-close images. This Miami is sort of based on a foundation of coral rock, and it's a type of stone that formed with the impression of coral life. So when you see the stone finely cut, you'll see impressions of different types of coral, brain coral, other types. It's quite a beautiful stone. It's also slightly porous, but very resilient for the climate and context of Miami. So buildings built out of coral rock are very strong and solid. Now, I'm just going to show this example briefly because I think it stands out from many of the examples from Miami. I was doing a tour with Samin Patel of Bombay Wala, and she was talking about the insurance companies and banks not far from here as examples of strong deco. To me, this would be strong deco in Miami and the downtown district. What you see is buildings from the 1920s and 30s that kind of reflect that New York skyscraper aesthetic and resemble more of what you would see in New York. So here you have a sort of a commercial business office building, high-rise. And this building is really, really spectacular. These images don't do justice. If you were to look at these elevator doors, they are embossed with images of Florida, fauna, and flora, and they're really, really beautiful. It also has the original escalator, this building, which is also quite spectacular. So a lot of the Art Deco elements within the interior of this building are really great. It also has an influence of the Spanish Mediterranean revival. So it's a building that combines the two within its interior. And I just have to show this because this is on the website advertising my talk. I'm going to focus today on two architects which are kind of the most famous of the Miami Beach Art Deco architects. We have Henry Hohauser and Elmer Ray Dixon, but there's a handful of other architects. Skislowitz is among them. Igor Polovitsky, who becomes more well-known for his mid-century architecture. Russell Pancoast. But this is a really great example of Art Deco adapting to its local context. So this one is located on Ocean Drive, and where buildings are located within Miami also impacts, I think, their visual aesthetic somewhat. And Ocean Drive are the hotels that are directly facing Miami Beach, directly facing the ocean. And this one very much recalls this idea of sort of an ocean liner. You could see sort of the facade, the way, and if you look at it from the side, sometimes it looks like, some of these buildings look like they're protruding forward, or sometimes their porches will resemble the deck of a ship. So it's taking that sort of oceanic aesthetic and sort of adapting it to sort of this very modern building. And I do want to show one other architect who shows up in Miami and Mumbai quite interestingly. This is Thomas Lamb. He's a Scottish-born, Scottish-American architect who works for MGM, and he's sort of an itinerant architect. So he's building buildings throughout the world. He travels both to Mumbai and Calcutta and does the metro cinemas in both cities. And 2 years prior to traveling to India, he comes to Miami, and he works on this sort of famous building, the Lincoln Theater. As you can see today is an H&M. H&M has actually done a really good job at renovating this building. They worked with the architecture firm Shulman and Associates, and Alan Shulman, he's a professor at University of Miami and has written a lot on the history of Miami's architecture. So he approached turning this building into a retail store with a certain sensitivity. How can we really highlight the Art Deco elements while you're shopping for shorts or t-shirts or dresses at H&M? Formerly, this building was actually abandoned as a theater in 1980, and then it was eventually in the 90s taken over by the New World Symphony, who then sold it to H&M and built another building by Frank Gehry just down the street right over here. But I think this is really interesting because we have an example of an architect who built theaters within 2 years of each other in both cities. And you could see some of those sort of really, really wonderful elements, sort of this frozen fountain meets tropical foliage motif in bas relief here, the sort of running banner. the sort of Lincoln Theater, sort of this theater marquee, which is a prominent feature, not just in theaters and cinemas, but you begin to see this in hotel architecture. So it's taking this idea of sort of the theater marquee and its prominence and adapting it to even residential architecture. And just to show the example of the Metro Cinema, which he worked with the British architect David William Ditchburn, who was based in Mumbai. And I just want to show you an image to show sort of the context of this renovation. Here you have the original main theater, quite fantastic, particularly with the sort of the way the light emanates from without. And then here today you have the H&M. The checkout counter is right there where the stage would be. But you could see that sort of visual aesthetic of the theater, they've been able to maintain it significantly within this, including on the lower level, the terrazzo floors. Now, today I'm going to focus, as I mentioned, on two architects. Now, Henry Hohauser is particularly interesting. He is an architect from New York. He studies at Pratt Institute, and he comes to Miami in the early 1930s, around 1932-33, and immediately becomes one of the most prolific Art Deco architects. Now, he did do a series of small bungalows in Queens, New York, prior to coming, which are still maintained and kind of interesting to see in comparison to sort of this more modern style that he takes on. And the Essex House, to me, is sort of a classic Henry Hohauser building. You have sort of this finial, which almost recalls sort of a radio antenna. You have the use of these round elements used to actually be porthole windows. They were later filled in. One of the interesting things is the decorative elements of each hotel in South Beach tells you about the type of clientele it would attract. So entrances, are the entrances flat or do you sort of step up slightly? This building would have been slightly more expensive than some of its neighboring hotels because it had larger octagonal port windows. And I'm sorry I don't have any images of the interior because the interior is really, really spectacular. What's most spectacular is there's a mural by one artist named Earl Lapan, who this building was completely abandoned in the 1970s and 80s. Most of its interior elements were stolen from it, including its original light fixtures. This is true of most Art Deco architecture in Miami by the 70s and 80s. I'll talk a little bit more about this. But when the hotel was refurbished in the early 1990s, the owner saw this mural that was sort of very much faded because the windows weren't covered and the sun was shining directly on the mural. And he ended up contacting Earl Lapan's son. He was able to find his information, and Earl Lapan was 91. He had less than 9 months to live, and he actually returned to the hotel and restored the mural. So you could see a mural restored by the artist decades later, and it's a really, really spectacular mural that's supposed to be a reflection on sort of Florida life. But this is a really great example. You have what we consider, and you see these in a lot of Bombay Deco buildings, sort of the eyebrows, sort of or the eaves over the windows. A lot of these buildings back then didn't have air conditioning because they were built to be budget hotels for the middle class and had smaller rooms. The idea is you'd only be there in the winter months. You'd go to your small room to sleep, and then during the day you'd hang out in sort of the more public, prominent areas. This hotel also has a small pool, which was unusual for the time for a lot of these hotels. But it's merely just one block from the beach. So this is sort of a great example of sort of the use, again, horizontal line, horizontal banding in threes, which you often see a rule of threes in Art Deco buildings in Miami, to create visual interest. And I mentioned the idea of the sort of the theater marquee being replicated in different hotels. I think you see this quite clearly in what is sort of a more modest hotel. I think one of the big differences between Mumbai Deco and Miami Deco, Miami Deco, there is a part of Miami Beach that it was built for residents of Miami Beach. It's more in the interior. But a large amount of the Art Deco buildings were hotels built for people who are only going to be there for part of the year. So there's not the sense of permanence, I feel, when I look at Mumbai Deco, where you have these prominent theaters and these very grand apartment buildings. A lot of these buildings were not made by reinforced concrete. They were made with simple wooden frames done as cheaply as possible, but also utilizing local materials and then using decorative elements to make them seem more glamorous. They would often emulate the names of famous hotels elsewhere, Palmer House, Tiffany, so they would try to get these names that created a sense of luxury, but these were very sort of economic buildings that used the decorative to enhance sort of what would be a simple sort of cubic structure. And these are some great just Henry Hohauser renderings. These are actually going to be on display at an exhibition at the Wilsonian FIU Museum. It's an exhibition called Deco Luxury to Mass Market, and it's looking at the introduction of Art Deco across the US. So here you get a great example of an apartment building by Henry Hohauser, the Liberty Apartments. Here is a drugstore, which has since, I believe this one has been destroyed, just used to be there on Washington Avenue, near Collins and Espanola. And then here you have the Park Central Hotel. Now, most buildings in Miami are not more than 3 stories. If you see one that's 5 or stories or more, likely suggests that it is reinforced, that there's a use of a steel frame within the building. And it also suggests that it's a hotel for a wealthier clientele. And Park Central would definitely be sort of a great example of that. Here we have a 6-story building, and you could see it in relationship to sort of these smaller, more modest hotels. So it would have stood out within its urban context. Excuse me for going through these quickly because I have too many images, as I mentioned. One of my favorite Henry Hohauser buildings is the Crescent, and I just think it has a very playful, creative facade. And one thing you could look at sort of this typeface. One of the things that's prominent in these buildings is the use of neon light. And so if you go to South Beach and you walk along Ocean Drive at night, you could see some of the buildings still have their neon lights. They've been restored. And it gives you that sense of sort of what would have made the city feel very modern and contemporary in its era. But here you can also see sort of this reference to train tracks immediately within the facade. And he makes, him and Lawrence Murray Dixon, the other architect I'm going to talk about, use these references to forms of transport all the time, particularly trains. And here you have sort of a great image of that sort of facade. And probably this is another building, Hoffman's Cafeteria. It was originally a cafeteria. This is on the corner of Collins and 14th. It's a very prominent location. And it's just another great example of sort of that sense of movement. There's sort of that sensuality with the curved form, the way it's taking advantage of its prominent siting at a street corner. And this building has an interesting history. Now you see it today. It's a Senor Frog's, a very mediocre Mexican restaurant. It's not bad. But here you can see it in its past. This likely reflects the color of what the buildings would have been in the era. A lot of them were white, gray, or muted tones with color accents. And I'll talk a little bit more about sort of the rebranding of Deco in the 1980s in Miami Beach. But this is when it was Warsaw Ballroom. This building has had multiple lives. It was originally a diner, then it was this famous gay club that Gianni Versace would frequent, and then it became a famous Jewish deli, which a lot of us are sad that it closed down. And I want to close my sort of preview of Henry Hohauser with this building, and this was Barbara Baer Capitman's favorite building. Now, Barbara Baer Capitman in the 1970s becomes very much invested in saving Miami Beach Deco. Now, there's a couple of major shifts that happen with Miami Beach Deco. One is World War II. World War II comes, and the Army uses Miami as a military base. And so any building that is a hotel that doesn't have permanent residents immediately becomes a military barrack. So a lot of these hotels suffer damage. After World War II, what happens is the military, after World War II, you have new constructions, what's considered Miami modern architecture, and that leads to sort of an abandonment of the Art Deco district. A lot of particularly Eastern European Jews moved to Miami. Actually, Yiddish becomes the second most spoken language in the 1960s and 70s in Miami Beach, and they used to call it God's waiting room. So what you have is a lot of abandoned hotels and a lot of an aging population. And Barbara Capitman sees this and sees a new interest in developers in buying out these properties and demolishing them, and becomes the biggest advocate. And I showed this building because this was her favorite building. And here what you see is beautiful, again, the use of horizontal lines, the eyebrows, sort of these really wonderful medallions that sometimes are called train wheels. Also, look at these columns and this, and I'm going to show a close-up image of that. Here we have the facade. This is the oolitic limestone, and what they do here is they fill the oolitic limestone with tinted concrete, and you'll see it in multiple colors in Miami Beach. And a lot of these buildings are really durable, both because of their terrazzo floors, which are outdoors on the terraces, but also as decorating these sort of balconies and these columns here. And so in this case, they use sort of a brown tinted concrete to fill it in, and it really gives you a clear image of sort of the imprints of coral life onto the stone. It's quite beautiful, and it upholds much more strongly than marble in this type of climate, particularly in the exterior. So a lot of these buildings have the original tinted coral rock, and they don't require much renovation because they're very sturdy. Now, another architect that becomes a prominence is Elmer Ray Dixon. Elmer Ray Dixon is a Floridian. He goes to the Georgia Institute of Technology and ends up working for the famous firm Schultz and Weaver in New York in the 1920s. Schultz and Weaver does a lot of prominent projects in Cuba in the 1920s, and I always, Alan Schumann has actually written a little bit about the life of Elmer Ray Dixon, but I've wondered what was his relationship with working with projects in Havana, and they also did a major project in Miami, what's today called the Freedom Tower. It was the building built for the Miami Times periodical. And they very much, Schultz and Weaver, they're most known for the Waldorf Astoria in New York. They kind of adopt this Mediterranean revival style in the context of Cuba and Miami. And he comes back to Miami. He does a few buildings in the Mediterranean revival style. He also does a couple that kind of mix it, but by the 30s, he becomes the most prominent Deco architect, and he's getting some of the biggest commissions. And the two hotels I'm going to show now are great examples of that. One thing you'll notice is this hotel is 7 stories tall. It's one of the taller hotels. It also has some of the most spectacular elements of the hotels. This is thought to be akin a little bit to sort of the Shanghai style of Art Deco. Here you got really the emphasis of verticality here. You would have, originally in this building, you could see that it's sort of beveled here. You would have 2 neon lights going up. So you'd have these 2 neon lights emphasizing the height of the building. That's then countered by these ribbon windows that stretch out to these porthole windows. So it's a simple but very beautiful and elegant facade. But what's really spectacular is the interior. And I remember when I was in high school, we used to skip class and we would go to South Beach. And I remember walking by this hotel was completely abandoned and boarded up. And it was in such a horrible, dilapidated state. So it's really interesting to see it today and see how it's been renovated. And there's multiple things. Here you have, and it's sad that this rug is covering it here, but you actually have 3 of these leading to the entrance, and they're supposed to be representations of very large train wheels, sort of these beautiful designed terrazzo floors. We have the original design of the Victor Hotel, which is a V created out of bamboo, sort of as a sort of interior wall light fixtures. And this is very unusual for Miami Beach because when these buildings were abandoned in the 70s and 80s, most of the light fixtures were stolen. But these light fixtures were so high up, no one could steal them because there was a 2-floor lobby. And so this is one of the few hotels you'll go into Miami Beach and see the original light fixtures. It's almost the sort of beautiful rocket-shaped futuristic light fixtures. And if you look to the very end here, you'll see a mural. I mentioned Earl Lepan did a mural for the Henry Hohauser building, the Essex House. This is also an Earl Lepan mural, which is quite beautiful and fantastic. So if you're ever in Miami, I highly recommend stepping into the lobby of this hotel and just getting a look at it and looking at the various beautiful decorative elements within. And I just want to show this because this shows the finials for both, elevations of the finials for both hotels. This was a study done later by the Design Preservation League. Now, another building that's quite prominent, you have these 2 tall buildings by Elmer Ray Dixon. These were hotels for a higher end of clientele. They were taller ones. And the Tides particularly was thought to be his sort of mini skyscraper. So he takes the idea of the skyscraper and creates it in a miniature form on the beach. It's about a 10-story hotel. And the facade is very fantastic. It's quite simple compared to its other Art Deco buildings. But again, you have sort of this rule of 3s. Look at the coral rock. Here you have the coral rock raw, and then here you have it tinted with sort of a salmon color. It's my favorite example of the tinted coral rock when it's a sort of beautiful salmon color. And so he's creating this facade with really, really nice visual interest. And excuse the quality of this image. This is the most full image I could get on the floor because today it's covered with furniture. But it also has really, really fantastic terrazzo floors. One of the things we did when I was a tour guide is we would let the floor lead us. Sometimes these floors are each unique designs, and they'll lead you to a room that used to be walled in. That was the illegal casino that was ran in a hotel. I had mentioned the presence of the mafia in Miami Beach. In 1929, the police started to crack down on the mafia in Miami Beach. So when these hotels were designed, they were designed to have these sort of illicit spaces where you could play card games and gamble. And this hotel has the most spectacular of these types of rooms. And I just want to show this because this is a very interesting and thoughtful renovation by Rachel Wheelsler in 2013. And she actually looked at historic photographs of the hotel and wanted to emulate some of the design. So she hired an artist, Georgina, to recreate these murals. These are black and white images, so we don't know what these murals would have looked like. So it's the artist's interpretation of what these murals were like. So it's the idea of trying to recreate the former Deco aesthetic in the contemporary. And I think this is the trend in Miami today, is to really embrace the Deco aesthetic, which wasn't always the case. And I want to talk about a few more of his buildings. These are along Collins between 11th and 12th Street. Elmer Ray Dixon dominates Collins between 11th and 13th Street. Most of the buildings on that street are buildings designed by him, each different owners, interestingly enough. But he designed this building and the 3 neighboring buildings north of it all at once in 1 year. And these buildings aren't symmetrical, but if you look at them, they look as if they're symmetrical within one block. So they're sort of a cohesive unit of 4 hotels. The Tudor is probably the most prominent with its decorative elements. And here again, you see the salmon coral rock, sort of this sort of antenna sort of going up quite beautifully. And then just a couple buildings down is the Kent Hotel. This one is more cheap. Literally, when you go down, you'll see that you don't step up to the entrance. It has a much more modest entrance than the 2 hotels next to it. But again, it has these beautiful, wonderful decorative elements. Now, one of the very sad things is the 4th building is missing. And this is an example of what was happening in the 1980s in Miami. Now, Barbara Baer Capitman in 1976 founds the Miami Design Preservation League and advocates for saving Miami Beach Deco because she foresees what's going to happen, developers coming in and wanting to build new buildings that were thought to be better for profit, but also not have to deal with how do you renovate a dilapidated building within the sort of tropical climate. A lot of these buildings were in a horrible shape and incredibly expensive to renovate. Famously, the New Yorker Hotel in 1981, she sort of puts herself in front of it and was arrested by the police. This is another building that she tried to save that was demolished in 1988 that very much completed this collection of Elmer Ray Dixon buildings. And it's really interesting because in 1979, Barbara Capitman and the Miami Design Preservation League are successful in advocating and getting the Art Deco district in Miami Beach federal recognition. So it becomes a historic, considered within the historic places. It's a federal historic community. It's the first example of 20th century architecture in the US getting the status, getting this federal recognition. And you have the sort of creation of a formal historic district between 5th and 17th Street and Ocean Drive and Alton. That is the Art Deco district. But this doesn't stop these buildings from being demolished. And this is a great example of that. Now, there are multiple efforts in how to save these buildings. One is federal legislation. The other is making these buildings more colorful. One of her good friends, Leonard Horowitz, who was an artist, started just painting these buildings to bring recognition. You had these abandoned, dilapidated buildings, and he'd bring a colorful, playful palette of pastels and bright colors that reflected the tropical setting. This is another Elmer Ray Dixon building, just cat-a-corner to the buildings I just showed you. I mentioned he dominates that block, the Marlin Hotel. And you could really get that sort of how color has redefined the visual elements. Typically, these buildings would be 2 tones and much more subdued. And now they're sort of these vibrant buildings. This really caught on. Miami Vice became very popular in this era. And one of the things Miami Vice producers would do is they would often film in these abandoned buildings, and they would paint them these colors to create that image within the set. So Leonard Horowitz did some buildings, and Miami Vice helped do the rest. And then developers would come in and paint them these playful colors that have become part of the Miami identity. But I always tell people these pastel colors are a complete invention of the 80s. They're very postmodern, speaking of the connection of postmodernism and Deco. And talking about preservation, probably the most famous example is the Villa Casa Casarina. This is more known as the Versace Mansion. And this was an apartment building at the time when Versace purchased it for $2.8 million in 1993. He not only purchases this home, and this home has a fascinating history, but I don't have the time to go into it. Its original owner, Alden Freeman, was quite quirky. But he also purchases right next to it the Revere Hotel, which is a 1950-style hotel. So it's not considered historic at this time, even though it's a great example of Miami modern architecture. And he demolishes it to build his really fabulous Italianate pool house. And this immediately gets preservationists riled up, because we're getting Art Deco, this sort of Art Deco has sort of the status, nationally speaking. It's suddenly recognized, but you have a lot of other buildings that are suddenly considered not as relevant, though they are architecturally interesting and important. But you also have someone who can easily just buy a property and destroy it at their own whim. Gianni Versace immediately sees that the Miami Design Preservation League and others are upset, so what does he do? He gives them a huge donation. And with that donation, they use it as a campaign to change local laws. So around 1994, you begin to see local legislation that creates very strict rules. And today, if you go to Miami Beach, if you want to add a level to a building, it has to be approved by the city. It has to be set back from the building. It has to not change the original composure of the building from the outside. If there are significant interior elements, terrazzo floors, in some hotels you'll even see the oolitic limestone counters. Those elements have to remain. So you could sort of carve into the inside of a building, but you have to keep certain decorative elements. So today there's very stringent laws, and I like to say we could partially thank Gianni Versace for his huge donation, because that really gave them the fuel and the economic means to advocate for this locally. And just another great example, this is the former Bombay Hotel. This is in North Beach on 69th and Collins. It was later renamed Golden Sands Motel. And here you could see how the building has been readapted today. So this is a very new construction by the architect Luis Revuelta, and they've kept the original building and set back the condo from it. So the original building is part of the condo, but it sort of maintained as well. And I think we're beginning to see a lot of this in Miami. People who want to build these mid or high rises, incorporating the original architecture while also and making it sort of this interesting element, because you could see a relationship between these two buildings. So I think this is quite a thoughtful design and a nice maintenance of this Miami modern building. Now, Miami modern, MIMO is what we call it locally, becomes very prominent post-World War II. Probably the most famous architect is Morris Lapidus, who very much famously said, "Too much is never enough." He was responding to Mies van der Rohe, the architect's "less is more," with the quite opposite claim. Like, let's just make it very spectacular and glamorous and fabulous. And so MIMO has become recognized locally as sort of a significant example of modern architecture. And I think Art Deco, at least within South Beach, is recognized as deserving of preservation, but there's still issues with saving some of the mid-century buildings. Most famously, the Miami Herald building along the bay in Miami was demolished a couple years ago, and a lot of people are very sad about that. I want to spend the last part of this talk talking a little bit about the issues modern architecture, both Deco and Miami modern, face. And one of them is hyperdevelopment. And I show this next to this image because whenever I go to Mumbai, I see these high rises and sky cranes everywhere, and it feels like home to me. And this is an example of the first boom that happened in the mid-2000s to show you how prevalent the condo high-rise boom was in Miami. In the mid-2000s, we had the second largest amount of sky cranes in the world after Dubai. We had the largest real estate boom in the US and the largest bust. And back then, it was a lot of particularly, for people who were purchasing condos, were a lot of sort of middle class, middle upper class within Miami thinking they'd flip it. So we had a huge rate of foreclosures, and for a brief period in the late 2000s, early 2010s, we had a lot of beautiful new 40, 50, 60-story skyscrapers that were mostly empty. But here you could see sort of this dramatic transformation of downtown Miami, which previously had a lot of parking lots. It was very much this mid-century downtown with patches of asphalt everywhere, suddenly being infilled by these high-rises. And it was locally referred to as the Manhattanisation of Miami. And this continues to be an ongoing threat. Miami's currently going through a new iteration of a boom, and it's much larger than the first boom. So we kind of have this, and it's throughout the city's history, these cycle of real estate booms and busts. But this always provides a threat to historic architecture. Miami Beach, particularly South Beach, a lot of the buildings are well protected, and actually the mayor of Miami Beach is very much interested in saving the mid-century modern architecture in North Beach. But in the context across the bay in Miami, the there's not as much of a keen eye towards preservation. So sometimes these buildings will replace significant modern buildings. And I think that's something that's significant to think about within the context of Mumbai, where you have sort of a similar condo high-rise, what seems to me like a boom. The other major issue we have in Miami is climate change. Miami is thought to be the city that economically will be most affected by global sea level rise. Every year there's the king tides and the whole city of Miami Beach floods. It no longer takes a hurricane or a major storm. It could just be the wrong time of the year. And it's really interesting because one of the things within the context of Miami, we are in a state where our governor declared that you cannot use the words climate change. So they've actually, the city of Miami Beach developed their own language. So it's like tidal response. So they've come up with their own language because in Miami Beach and in Miami, there's not this denial of global climate change. People who've lived on Miami Beach have seen, because it's so flat, have seen the ocean rise, have seen the increase of storms, and have started to create solutions. Actually, at Grinnell, we had the environmental manager, Margarita Wells, give a speech on campus, and it was really fascinating because she talked about the various innovations. And I think Miami is a very fascinating place for thinking about what Stephanie Wakefield, the urban geographer, describes as urban resilience. So the creation of pump stations. What you have is the literal rising of streets. And you can kind of see it here. You see these people down here? That's where the street used to be. The street has been risen 2 feet or more through parts of Miami Beach. This is up by 20th Street and Alton Road. You also have that by West Avenue. You have these, the streets are being risen and the buildings are being sunken. And they're creating at the lower level of the building a way to respond, both through sandbags, but also making sure that the fenestration isn't porous so that if you close the doors, everything within the building is protected. So you have this immediate architectural response to the flooding that's happening now within Miami Beach. A lot of people think, particularly with the pumping stations, these solutions are good for 30 to 50 years. What happens afterwards is still questionable. And I just love this as an artist rendering of imagining what these Art Deco buildings on Ocean Drive will look like sunken in feet of water. It's a bit dramatic. But I do think there's an interest of this. And this is a project that was done out in Miami Beach for Art Basel Miami. It's done by an LA-based artist, Lars Jan, who's obsessed with sort of what's happening in Miami. I've written a little bit about buildings. There's a lot of architects using stilts, so building buildings on stilts, sort of precipitating this, both within new condos, but also prominent architecture. The Perez Art Museum Miami, designed by Herzog de Marone, is a great example of putting buildings on stilts to try to evade what is this, thought to be this eventual aquatic sort of inundation. So this artist sort of plays with that in multiple ways, and he's done multiple installations that's engaged that, and this is one where the water actually rises. It's a barrier against this building, and you could see the water rising and sort of the way it inundates the building. And so this is a constant concern in Miami. We have, in one sense, the development that can affect preservation, but you also have rising waters. But I like to close with one of my favorite Miami Beach Deco buildings. It's quite a simple building. This is the Miami Beach Patrol headquarters. If you look here, you see this coral rock. It's like a short wall. This was actually designed in the mid-1920s. And the beach was experiencing flooding, and sometimes they'd go into the hotels. The terrazzo floors really can withstand inundation. They're very strong and sturdy, so they've experienced flooding and have remained a strong quality. But they built this barrier in the 1920s. The ocean was much closer back then. Most of Miami Beach is artificial, imported sands and dredged sands from out of the ocean. But they created this in the 1920s to sort of stop the ocean. And then here in 1934, you have this really wonderful Beach Patrol headquarters. You have sort of this is sort of, I think, an icon of Miami Beach. And really, I think these buildings, though I mentioned earlier that Mumbai feels the buildings have more of a permanence, there's something that's sort of really wonderful and fantastic about Art Deco that I also think has a permanence, and almost a floating permanence. This building very much resembles the deck of a ship. You can imagine the captain looking out from the Beach Patrol headquarters, leading into the ocean. So it has that sort of sense of movement and this relation to this building being very much in front of the beach. And I think that these buildings show a permanence in style and luxury and beauty, and that they're part of our urban identity that will stand the test of time and continue to represent our inherent modernity. Thank you.
Fredo, that was fabulous. I think you could have gone on and
Sorry if I went on for too long.
no, and a lot of questions out there I can sense, but I'm going to ask you a few, so to set the tone. Firstly, there were a lot of similarities while you were speaking, I could just sense, with this city. One is the facades, the look, the feel of what we call Tropical Deco. There are buildings with marine and nautical themes, Suna Mahal being one of them. Across the road is Sundar Mahal. I would even argue Empress Court at a pinch, all looking like ships forging through the oceans, portholes. So that could be because of the fact that they were on the coast. But I think there's something more. At least here, one can sense that this city was looking outwards. It has always looked towards the west. It has always considered itself, and more so at that time, as part of a global chain of international cosmopolitan cities. And this was very much an expression of Indian cosmopolitanism of the 1930s and mid-30s. Indian money, Indian designers, Indian finance, Indian customers, and we are very close to now becoming an independent nation. So this is part of that looking outside. Then, of course, the few other things, the terrazzo flooring. I go to a lot of homes and see terrazzo flooring, and my heart soars because many of them have converted to marble. Gleaming, white, beautiful Italian marble, but it's not the same. A few other things also just caught my eye when I was listening to you. I was just thinking, prohibition. There was prohibition here too at that time. And you pointed out Bombay. There's a building in Bombay called Miami Apartments. Yes. So but how do you explain, you mentioned that the Miami architects, the American architects never traveled abroad. And the same about the Indian architects. They didn't go for the grand tour. How do you explain this trend happening all over the world, more or less, at the same time? What were the influences that were flowing back and forth?
That's a great question. I think in one sense it connects to technology and the way we communicate and we trade. And there's this interesting thing. Art Deco is very much connected to the commercial. So you have, and I would even go as far as arguing that it's the first true architecture of globalization, and this is something I'm interested in exploring academically, given its interest in a sort of diverse past. So it's drawing locally, but it's also drawing from multiple examples around the world that doesn't represent a colonial relationship. And it's the way information is being spread. So you do have, even these architects, we could call it more commercial, but they are reading Le Corbusier likely. They're reading what's popular in its time, and they're interpreting it to a different means and based on sort of the fads and fashions of their clientele, who see themselves as of this world. So I really think it's this new forms of connection that create sort of a greater speed of communication, a sort of broader sense of sort of the availability of consumer goods. And I think it's also interesting that these buildings not only take on these nautical themes, but sometimes you could step into a certain stairwell in a building and feel like you're on a ship. And so it's resembling these forms of transport that allow certain people, a greater mobility. So it's a question of sort of that connection to mobilities that I think impacts.
Also, two or three other things were going on. Cinema was coming into its own. The talkies had just started around the 30s. And of course, as we know, that a lot of cinemas in Bombay, Delhi, elsewhere in the country were built. And I presume the same in the United States. So it was also technology, new emergent technology that played a role. And as you said, consumer goods, there were exhibitions here talking about furniture. One very important thing in Bombay of the time was people moving out of traditional homes into these apartments. Many people resisted. One of the objections was bathrooms were inside the flats. The other thing was, who wants to live near the sea? Those were some of the discussions. And of course, it was very, very expensive. So did all that come together, cinema, voyaging, you talked about Tutankhamun's tomb coming, international global themes, Egypt, the ziggurat, all that.
No, absolutely. And I'm even thinking about, you're mentioning this, the form of some of these buildings. One of the Smithsonian FIU has a great collection of industrial design. And if you look at the old radios or the cameras, the form, the shape, the equipment, the buildings become to resemble this. So you have the curved edges, the use of lines or grooves to represent that sort of visual aesthetic, that sense of movement. So it immediately becomes replicated in the architecture to express, and also interesting to think about the role of cinema more broadly. Even if you're looking at Le Corbusier's architecture, his villas, which are much more functionalist, there's still this sort of sense of moving through space that can be seen as cinematic. So the way architects are understanding space in this early 20th century era is very much influenced by these new technologies. It's sort of like Baroque architecture responds to theater and the idea of the stage. Art Deco very much responds to the idea of the filmic space.
Now, one of the things, and I think Atul did point out, is that we think in Bombay, we think of Art Deco, and we normally associate it with Marine Drive, the Oval, a few of the financial institutions in South Bombay, you call them solid deco or something.
Deco strong, that's
okay, well, I call it fascist deco. It's got a kind of looming presence in our life. But there's a lot of middle class housing further down in the center, which you may have gone and see Matunga, Dadar, King Circle, Bandra, and all that. So these were really new ways of living for an emerging middle class, weren't they?
Yes.
Was it the same in Miami?
Absolutely, absolutely. And if you go to what's today the Overtown neighborhood, it was formerly Colored Town. You had the first major black architect in Miami who did a few Art Deco style buildings. One of the first doctor's offices to open up in Colored Town was done in the Art Deco style. So you see it being emulated in other areas that are outside of this prominent Art Deco district. And that's something that's been studied a little bit, but sort of where do you see Art Deco elsewhere in the city, I think is a question that's prevalent for both cities, because both cities are known for having this very prominent, significant Art Deco district that I think is unique. And
a concentrated area, is that what you're saying? Yeah. Now, coming to heritage and preservation, Barbara, what's the...
Baer Capitman.
Yeah, she protested, she fought, you said she was arrested, so she was really militant about it, and that saved a lot of buildings. The efforts here have been somewhat slower, but no less significant, and only now, but at the same time there is a sense in heritage circles here, especially in official circles, that we've got these wonderful Gothic structures and all that. Should we really be looking at these buildings? Because this is a private initiative.
I like to say the Art Deco buildings are more uniquely Indian than the Victorian architecture. The Bombay Gothic architecture is spectacular, and it's a unique model of thinking of Gothic within tropical context, which is not prevalent elsewhere in the field, where there's very few similar examples. But what you begin to have with the context of Art Deco in Mumbai is Indian-born architects who are taking this on. You have sort of a notion of cosmopolitanism that I think is connected to the politics of nationalism, the movement towards independence. So while it's a global architecture, it's also peculiar and specific to here, and I think is very rich. And part of the city's identity, from an outsider coming in, that's sort of my perception.
No, definitely there are local touches. I mean, there are buildings with friezes which are totally Indian, and you see the farmers and industrial, factories, but mainly Indian-looking people, Indian-looking themes and all that, especially in the financial institutions, New India Assurance and all that kind of thing. So there was an Indian accent to all this. But yet, also this part is built on reclaimed land. So, when you were talking about, climate change and all that, I think it's going to eventually affect everybody. Right. Now, why did you say that local laws made a difference? Because you said that federal laws were very important, but local laws made a difference.
Federal laws could be ignored locally. It's that simple. It's you have a law, but then how is the law carried out? That you could say this is a federally, historically significant building. It's within our historic district. It should be preserved. But how do you stop a developer from coming in and demolishing it? Because there is no sort of oversight within the Register for Historic Places within the U.S. It's sort of a labeling that gives you that prominence. Look, we're a significant site nationally, but it's not a law that's carried out. When you have local laws, because it's often any developer who's going to build a building within Miami Beach has to sort of go to a local board.
Including interiors.
Including interiors. Within the Art Deco district, yes.
Yeah,
Elsewhere, that's not necessarily the case, but within the Art Deco district, if there are significant material elements of the interior, you're asked to preserve that. You could totally recarve the interior and remake it. And a lot of these buildings aren't useful in a contemporary context to sort of the layout or the program of the building. So they need to be readapted. But there is sort of this specific effort to sort of keep it. But it really took local legislation and a growing awareness among local politicians. Because often you have these sort of questionable relationships between developers and local politicians, and how do you change that relationship? So that the developers are working with the preservationists rather than against the preservationists.
Did the value of these apartments go up after they were preserved?
Extremely. And one of the interesting things in Miami Beach, the major developer that came in the 1980s and 90s was a man by the name of Tony Goldman. And Tony Goldman was most famous for first working in the 1970s in the Soho district of New York. And he was a developer that was very tuned to the value of the architecture, and he would actually bring artists in to repurpose spaces. So he's kind of an artist who's developer who's associated with new models of gentrification. So he comes into Soho, brings artists into these warehouse spaces. Soho becomes the trendy area in New York, and now it's the commercial shopping district. South Beach has had a similar process, where in the 90s, a lot of artists came in, it became trendy. You had sort of Gianni Versace, the film The Birdcage, which if you haven't watched, you should, because it's the ultimate South Beach aesthetic in a film. And so the city becomes sort of this sort of alternate kind of queer and artsy site. But today it's very commercialized. It's hotels and box stores. And the property is really expensive. Now he's worked in the Wynwood neighborhood in Miami with urban art. Tony Goldman recently passed. But I think it's interesting that certain developers know how to capitalize on the existing infrastructure rather than create a model of demolish and build anew, which I think is much more inventive and creative and respectful heritage of a space.
You may have seen that many of the buildings here are in poor shape. The facades, even the structure itself and all that kind of thing. And that's perhaps because of, laws, rent control, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that there could be models which could be incorporated to make them better?
Absolutely. And I actually think the Victor Hotel, which I showed the interior of, if you had seen that building 15 years ago and seen the state it was in, you'd be shocked to see how it looks today and how much it's preserved its original, not only preserved its original elements, but really enhanced them. And there's some things with the decor I feel like they should show off their terrazzo floor more, but they've very much maintained the interior and found a use and value for the building that makes it now a very popular hotel. It's also, I didn't mention it, but part of the hotel, I believe it's owned by Best Western, I could be wrong, but they've included an addition, an extension of the hotel that's a new contemporary building, but it's done to not visually dominate the tower. So the 7 stories of the Victor stands taller than the 4 or 5 stories of the extension, and it's created with a certain horizontal access that counters the vertical access. So it's sort of the new part of the hotel that extends from the old part that pays respect to the splendor of the Art Deco architecture and is cohesive with it. So I think Miami is an interesting model to think about the different types of renovations with former modern architecture. And I think there's a lot of successful models and examples within Miami.
You were a guide for a few years.
That was in between academic jobs.
Was there a lot of interest from outside Miami for walks?
Absolutely. So there are 3 companies that do Miami Art Deco walks. One is the Miami Design Preservation League, and then there's 2 other competing companies. I worked for one of the private companies. I I want to say Art Deco tours, Miami, and they do really what's nice is the Miami Design Preservation League tours are very popular. So sometimes 20 to 40 people show up for a tour. But because they're larger groups, and they do 2 tours a day through the high tourist season. So you'll have these sort of large groups going building by building. Our company did smaller tours, so we did up to 8 people, and by doing smaller tours, we were able to go inside the lobbies and go to the rooftops of buildings. We had made arrangements with hotels so that we could really highlight the interior elements, which the Preservation League tours don't allow. So during the high season, there are days where I'd have 3 tours, 5-6 days a week, back to back. And those were the private tours. Those are outside of the Preservation Design, Miami Preservation Design League tours, which are very popular. So it's interesting today. It's almost like the educational thing tourists do. When they come to Miami Beach, they come for the sun and the fun, but they do take time to like think about the architecture and the heritage, which is quite nice.
How do you see a global connection emerging now among people trying to preserve old Art Deco and among people who are interested in Art Deco? What are the global connection possibilities and how would that help?
That's a good question. I think it would help to, most of the scholarship on an academic level in Art Deco is done in specific places, so New York, Paris. And I think it would sort of perhaps dismantle the Eurocentrism that exists within architectural history to consider the multiple iterations, whether we're talking about East Africa. So the Italians, when they colonized East Africa, did iterations of Deco and modern architecture in Eritrea and Ethiopia. We have the context of South Africa, where Art Deco is huge and had a completely different history. Brazil. So it would allow us to see how ideas were connected to our material world in a very real way. And I think that there is a call for greater scholarship. And I do think it's happening, particularly among the various Art Deco organizations that are developing worldwide, sort of finding these connections that sort of highlight the many ways we're interconnected in unexpected ways.
So I think we should throw it open to some questions. There are a lot of Art Deco buffs here, architects too, and people who love the city. So please ask questions.
Thank you. There are people living in Art Deco buildings in Mumbai, and there are people living in Art Deco buildings in Miami. How much do people in Miami know about their building and this aspect of the architecture?
I like to think there's a huge amount of awareness in Miami, but perhaps that's a bias of someone who studies architecture and is from Miami. But I think Miami has somewhat made Art Deco its identity beginning in the 80s and 90s, especially in the 90s. So there's this immediate association with the Deco that then kind of influences new forms of architecture there. So I do think there is an awareness among the residents. I don't know if that's so much the case here.
Was that a conscious effort on the part of somebody, of some groups, to actually build up this awareness?
Yes. And one of the things the Preservation League does is every year they hold a huge Art Deco fair, or festival rather. And the festival, there's lectures, there's booths, so there's this whole sort of culture around celebrating that which is Art Deco that is part of the city. So I do think, in a way, it's sort of advocacy within the city. And then a lot of the times when you see images of Miami, the images that are sort of projected globally, people see these images of South Beach. So it's something that I think is part, and it probably goes back to popular culture, to Miami Vice and these films done in Miami, that sort of relate the Art Deco to sort of this image of the city that then local residents take in.
And what about us here in Mumbai? Is there any conscious understanding of these architectural elements in the buildings they live in here?
I think interest is definitely growing. People want to know, definitely. There's no question about that. People living in it, people outside, people want to know details. Naina, what do you say?
Nobody in my building knows anything about it. I got a horse trying to tell them.
But tell me.
But now I hope, hopefully if we get the UNESCO thing going, and we've been trying to tell people. Shirin, what about you?
My building is down the road from Nina's. I'm in Courtview. And we have a great awareness and a great sense of pride if that UNESCO World Heritage Site thing comes through, which we are hoping will happen soon. Right?
But you do know that in certain other parts of this city, people are desperate to demolish their old bungalows.
Well, it's like that down our row also. There was some talk a few months ago of the FSI being increased in this area. And residents in my building who should know better said, oh, we'll increase the height, let's demolish, let's put pylons around the building, let's raise it to another 2 floors. I said, you'll have me as your enemy from now on. I'm telling you, be warned.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so when we have, we're trying to preserve the heritage here, we're talking about raising awareness. I know Art Deco Mumbai is doing a great job at that. And also, as you said, with Miami, with the Vice and the cultural production of that, what are some tactics, if you had to make a list of things that Mumbai could do to sort of raise awareness, if that's a good question.
That's a great question. And it's really interesting to talk about what's the interest, because if you step back 3 or 4 decades in Miami, there wasn't that much interest in Deco. So I think you can have this switch. And one of the things Barbara Baer Capitman did, I think it's kind of akin, and the Preservation League did, it's kind of akin to what Art Deco Mumbai is doing now, it's just documenting it. Being aware of what's there, because we know of certain buildings in Miami because the Preservation League documented them before they were demolished. And that's a valuable history to have. So in one sense, the documentation is key. And then going and seeking out those connections. One of the things Barbara Baer Capitman did with 2 colleagues of hers is they became interested in exploring Art Deco throughout the US. Art Deco was largely under-recognized throughout the US. And she died, I believe it was early 1990s. It was unexpectedly in 91 before she could finish this book project. But her 2 colleagues finished it. And in it, they almost did these typologies across the US. How many banks did we see? How many train stations did we see? And they began to make this case that Art Deco wasn't just prominent in Miami, it's obvious when you're in South Beach. But you could go to a small town in the US and see Art Deco architecture. And that this architecture could be demolished. So to me, it's interesting that they not only documented it, but then began to think about it more broadly, how it related to the US. And now I think there's more of a move to see how this exists throughout the globe and what it means in different places. So documentation's important. I think engaging publics in different way is important. It's hard to emulate the Miami model where a show like Miami Vice becomes globally popular and then you have images of Art Deco. We can't emulate that. But I think the Preservation League in Miami has done a lot of tactics that show approaches that are quite practical. And one of it is just architectural documentation and working with contemporary architects who have an interest in preservation and local communities.
So thank you so much for the talk. I just have one question. It's you showed the picture of Metro Cinema, and then you also showed the picture of Lincoln Theatre in Miami. And Metro Cinema has now become Metro Inox. And it kind of rings with our lovely government's policy of adopt a heritage. And so how does one reconcile with private enterprise and private entity sweeping into heritage and conservation work?
That's a great question. I almost feel it's unavoidable, and perhaps the example of H&M coming into the Lincoln Theatre is an example of that itself. It's a private enterprise coming in and claiming what was formerly a theater space as a space that now sells clothing that's largely produced in other parts of the world at very cheap prices. So there's a whole politics behind that as well that needs to be considered. But at very least, because of the stringent laws within Miami Beach, it forces private enterprise to work with stakeholders within the community to maintain the architecture. And so much so to hire a firm to redo the interior of an architect that's also done a lot of historical scholarship and preservation work within Miami. So I think it's about, at the local and perhaps municipal political level, creating these incentives that sort of not necessarily force, but really encourage private enterprise to work with local stakeholders to help protect that heritage.
Sincere. Mike?
Sure. So can you expand on your idea about the Deco being the first globalization idea?
Absolutely. And this is something I've just been thinking about. I teach modern architecture at my university. My modern architecture class, it's the modern architecture survey, but I've titled it Modern Architecture and Globalization, partially because I feel the traditional modern architecture survey focuses heavily on, at least in the US, on Western Europe and North America. So I've tried to challenge that. So when we do Gothic, we talk about John Ruskin and Viollet-le-Duc and what they were doing in France and England. And then the next class, I talk about it in Gothic architecture in the rural Midwest and in Mumbai. And so I kind of have this sort of model. And as I've been teaching the survey, I've been noticing one of the interesting things, you look at Art Nouveau and you look at sort of the adaptation of Art Nouveau abroad. And Art Nouveau precedes Art Deco, it's very much connected to it. It's almost connected to somewhat of this sort of colonial heritage as well. It's coming from a single place. You could almost trace a line. This is a huge generalization. Art Deco interests me because you could kind of center it around places like Paris and New York, but it's this very diverse global movement that then is very different in its various local iterations. And I think both the reference to technology is significant in globalization, but also the sort of the drawing from other civilizations and cultures. And there is a flattening that happens in the sort of geometric abstraction of visual cultures of other societies and other histories. But it kind of reflects sort of this interest in the broader world and then making it make sense within the local, which I think is an important aspect of globalization. And I think that's prominent in Art Deco everywhere you see it. And it's, you know, it's not Anglophone, it's not Francophone, it's very much this sort of global architecture. So it's connected to sort of these prominent intellectual and sometimes morally influenced movements in Europe, whether you're talking about the Bauhaus or Siam with Le Corbusier. But it's that sort of, I want to say it's more horizontal in sort of its outreach. And then it's also very much embedded in the local. It means something different in each place. So to me, I kind of identify it as sort of that time period that represents ideas of architecture being more fluid, and it's sort of this manifestation of that visually and materially.
Yes, two unrelated questions. One is a clarification. You mentioned that in some of the low-rise hotels along the Miami beach, the buildings were actually wooden frame. So would that mean that then they were finished with a stucco facade to look like, say, a building like this? That's one question. And the other one is that given the depression that comes at the end of the 1920s, how do you account for the sudden boom in Art Deco, especially in the 1930s? So that there is a lot of building. One would have thought that the Depression may have brought a lot of building activity, at least to a temporary stop. So that part is something which is very interesting, because I don't know how that works out.
That's a great question. And I think it's interesting. One of the things that explains, it's kind of implied in your question, the use of cheaper materials, including stucco, which you would have a lot of sort of stucco facades, or they would use methods of faux marble in some hotels so that it looked like marble, but it's not marble. I forget the name. It begins with, forgetting the exact term for it, but they use a mixture of plaster and glue with pigments to create something that's like a faux marble within a few of the buildings. And coming out of the Great Depression, I think that explains the cheapness of some of the materials within the. Really, Deco becomes more prominent in Miami Beach, 33, 34, when the US is starting to sort of move away from the Great Depression. And Miami avoids the Great Depression a little bit, because up until 33, you still have prohibition. So there's still money coming in through the illegal trade of alcohol in this era. So Miami is this interesting paradigm. What really economically harms Miami Beach is the Great Hurricane of 1926 because it destroys so many properties and the city needs to rebuild. And the city makes a robust effort. If you look at the original city hall that's built a year later in 27, it's sort of this high-rise, steel-framed Spanish Mediterranean revival building, and it's trying to show we will recover from this. It's sort of a symbol of that architecturally. It took a while for the city to sort of reach that sort of prominence. By the mid to late 30s, Miami Beach is a very popular site as the US is slowly beginning to recover from the economic boom. So I think part of the economy of these buildings is connected to that sort of history of the hurricane and the depression, but then also Miami's role as sort of the city of vice and sort of people escaping from that.
So the recovery is quite swift, actually.
Fairly swift. By the late 30s, you have so many hotels being built. So you could trace when buildings were built, because 33, 34 is when you see the earliest hotels being built. And by the late 30s, you have most of the examples I showed were between 37 and 39. So this is huge boom that happens prior to World War II.
So in your presentation, you spoke about a lot of buildings that have design elements that draw inspiration from different modes of transportation, like the train tracks and the train wheels. So was that intentional or was it incidental? Like, did the architect think that, oh, I want this to look like a train track? Or was it because it was so popular at that time?
In most cases, it was quite intentional.
I'm sort of curious, I'm a historian, so I'm thinking about the intent, maybe the ideology at the time, the thrust toward the tension between a sort of democratizing logic of these designs, which is decoration, design, elegance, including with cheap materials for the people, at least for the middle classes, but not just. I mean, movie theaters were the most accessible form, as opposed to legitimate theater. In certain countries, I don't know if it was true here or in Miami, factories were being built using Art Deco elements so that the workers would have a sort of elegance. In the Soviet Union, the whole metro system in Moscow used Art Deco because everybody should live surrounded by decoration. On the other hand, a lot of them are private houses. So the tension between the private, the elite, and the democratizing logic of it. Your thoughts?
That's a really interesting point. It makes me think about, in a sense, you could think about the public and the private and the role of leisure, and because within private space, but also within public spaces. And I perhaps don't have an articulate response to this, but it does make me also think that this is the jazz age. And even the way these hotels, the program of these buildings, you'd go into your small private space at night, and then you'd go into the public space, and you'd have sort of this experience of leisure that was sort of public and out there, and then you'd go back into sort of the private space. So within the buildings, you have sort of this interesting ideal of going into the private property that you're purchasing, but then experience it in a sort of a communal sense. It's also interesting to think, one of the examples I almost showed, but I didn't, was the post office in South Beach, which is on Washington Avenue and 12th, which was built through funds through the Works Progress Administration in the US. The WPA, something very important that Franklin Delano Roosevelt sort of program that he promotes to sort of help the US get out of its depression and create these jobs for the public. And that is actually a more formal architecture built with finer materials compared to this private enterprise, which is done more in a more economic manner. So there's interesting things happening, and then I think it'd be interesting to compare these private enterprise versus the buildings that represent the public sector within the context of Miami.
Incidentally, for a lot of people will know this, but still, Bombay has many factories and industrial, kind of manufacturing and other kinds of buildings. For example, a laundry in Suri, which is a beautiful Art Deco building. Unfortunately, these are now, in areas where, it's become difficult to access. But if you go towards that side, you'll see a lot of buildings that are still made in that same style. I don't know whether you've seen the Beauty Art Laundry. It's exactly a beautiful building made in that style.
No, we haven't.
Well, you should.
There's a lot for us to see and document, and as I mentioned, the city is so vast and so dense that it's quite a Herculean effort, but we'll get there. It's going to take us a bit of a while. So thank you, everybody. I just want to very quickly acknowledge a few people, obviously Professor Rivera and Sidharth, for making the time and for such a stimulating presentation, and in some sense bridging the gap between Miami's Tropical Deco and Bombay's unique Deco. The museum, who so readily gave us this venue today and encouraged us for this event, my fellow trustees for their support and guidance, and a big shout out to my colleagues. Nitya is a conservation architect who heads documentation. Nitya. She's the backbone of Art Deco Mumbai. Shubhika, where are you? Shubhika is our communication and design practitioner head, and Anshika is a heritage professional. They are just 3 people and they work like 30, trust me. The evening wouldn't be complete without acknowledging the masters of Deco who created this body of incredible work across the city's landscape, giving it a style and expression that is so unique to Bombay. And these masters are here. We actually have been in touch with Mr. Sathe, who is the son of the original Mr. Sathe, who was a part of the firm Master Sathe and Bhuta, and we record his oral histories. He couldn't be here today, but we're very grateful for his support. And I think as much as we acknowledge Stevens and what he did for the VT station, and then his son did, interestingly enough, with Regal Cinema, I think we should close with an appreciation and acknowledgement of what these people have given us across the city, which is an identity for a modern and cosmopolitan Bombay. Thank you.